So if you have a Nikon camera like I do, you might want to watch this video to learn the best video settings. Stay tuned. So in my first video of this version, I already made a specific in-depth video of specifically what you need for your video, like the contrast setting, the saturation, and all that stuff. And I'll put that link in down below. But for part 2 of this video, I'm going to talk about why is it that when you buy Nikon cameras, why are the settings set to the standard profile? Because the truth is, when you buy Nikon cameras, specifically like the ones I have now, which is the D5200 or the 53 or the 55 or 56, is that companies like Nikon like to have and boast beautiful, contrasty, and really saturated images. And they do this to, like, when people try it out and demo the products, then they get these really saturated pictures, which is great for photos. But if you shoot video like I do on a Nikon, you need to be very aware of this. And the last thing you want on when you're editing videos on a Nikon is to have oversaturated and over contrasted images. So it doesn't matter, this rule applies to Nikons, Canons, or whatever. You want to make sure your camera profile is set so that the saturation is not as high and the contrast is not high as well. You want this to be lowest as possible, which is why cameras like Sony and other cameras which have cinematic built-in presets, so that whether that's S-Log, V-Log, they have it for a reason, so then you can edit in post-processing and further, instead of having everything inbuilt, so then you don't really have much of a fluctuation when it comes to editing. Which is why I recommend, if you're a Nikon user, you better have these settings, which are already linked in the video below. So it's pretty much having your saturation turned down, sharpness turned down just a smidge, and your overall contrast as well. Once you have that, you will see what this Nikon camera can actually do and produce in terms of video quality. The next best video setting for your DSLR, specifically for Nikon, is that I got a comment, and that person is like, what autofocus do you leave on when you're filming videos? And the truth is, especially if you're using a Nikon, this is for all you Nikon users, you do not want to put your Nikon on autofocus. And I'll give you a prime example of why I don't use autofocus. And it's actually not that bad on this camera because on this lens, because I'm using the Sigma 17 to 50. But if you buy especially if you buy the kit lens that comes with this Nikon, which is the 18 to 55, I definitely do not recommend you film this in continuous autofocus, especially if you don't have an external lav, because Nikons are known to have really loud and bad autofocusing systems. They're good for photos, but videos not so much. So whenever I shoot a video for my videos, my vlogs, I usually have it set on autofocus servo. In other words, you hit the autofocus, hit it once, make sure it's in focus, and then I put it back to manual so it stays in this focus. And that's how I focus my videos. I never have it continuously on autofocus. That is a disaster waiting to happen. When it comes to having the best video quality for any camera, not even Nikon, is to make sure your ISO is as low as it can go. Even though a lot of people crap on Nikons, if this camera shoots at 100 ISO and you have decent lighting, and as well as a 1.8 aperture, a shallow depth of field, this camera can produce some beautiful video in 1080p that often gets overlooked by other cameras. I would say, one of the reasons I am so in tune with Nikon, because it's still one of the cameras that I first got and I still use to this day. So make sure you don't overuse the ISO. Use ISO as a last resort, and especially if you're using a Nikon like I am, D5200, you don't want to go anything above 800 ISO to have clean images. And for that, more of that cinematic look, you want to go for an aperture of 1.8, 2.8, or even 3.5 zoomed in. Gets you some shallow depth of field so it looks more cinematic. And that's how I produce shots that look like these. And my last and final tip when it shoots to DSLR best video settings is that you want to have your shutter speed pretty much double that of your frame rate. So if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, the closest to that is 1/50. Shooting at 60 frames per second, you want to be shooting at 1/20, so it gets that natural kind of motion blur effect. Here, I'll give you an example. I'm just gonna bump the shutter speed up to 1/500. Gonna bump the ISO to 2500, and this is like, this does not look natural, right? It's like, versus you can see that motion blur, which is common theme throughout movies and is pretty much the cinematic standard. So whenever you go outside and shoot videos, just be aware of things like making sure your in-body profile of your Nikon camera or Canon or whatever camera you decide to use for a DSLR for a video, make sure saturation is turned down, contrast is turned down, sharpness is turned down just a little bit, make sure your ISO is low, having a shallow depth of field, and follow focus or manual focus. And those are my key tips on how you better have the best video settings for your DSLR, or specifically Canon for this video, I mean Nikon. And that is how you get the best video for your bang for your buck. People often think you need thousands of dollars to produce really cool and crisp and cinematic videos. But from my example, all these shots that I'm showing you, this is from my Nikon D5200. And if I can do it, you can do it. And my name is Peter. You're watching Broke Visionary Collective, where we all start with nothing, but you can always create something. Cheers.